So I'm glad that you all joined in, and I'm glad for your perspective. I echo my colleague Yusra, so I wish you all a very blessed month. Thank you for joining again. So what I will do is I'll start because I want to be mindful of the time, and I want to thank those who came. We'll start with a little introduction about maybe the school, so that allows anyone who's joining still has a little bit of time. So I like this quote from Sheikh Mohammed. He says, "The aim is a government that can move quickly, make decisions, and deal with changes, and more adeptly seize opportunities in dealing with this new stage in our history, a swift and agile government." So a lot of the work we do at Mohammed bin Rashid School of Government echoes what His Highness has set as a vision. And I think with the pandemic, these last 2 years, it has even more highlighted why this topic is so critical. We need agile governments, especially the challenges that we face. Nothing we've done in the past can prepare us for the future, sometimes with the crisis. Now, Mohammed bin Rashid School of Government was formed in 2005 by a decree, and our purpose was to focus on, public policy and public governance. We were mandated to become the leading institute in the Arab world. To that extent, we do several things. We teach, we have master's programs, but we also do executive education, we consult, we do research. So it's very interesting in the whole perspective how we fit into the ecosystem. We have 4 programs. I myself head the Masters of Innovation Management. We have Dr. Emmanuel, who's with us, who heads the Masters of Public Policy. We have Dr. Raquel, who heads the Masters of Public Administration. And we have Dr. Yusuf, who heads the Executive MPA. So at the end, if anyone's interested in these programs, we will also take questions for that. That's our tagline. It's about empowering future leaders. Just a little bit about myself. I love to write, so you'll see me writing a lot of books. So I've done stuff on future governments. These are edited books. The Agile Government book is forthcoming. It should be out in May. It's just come straight out of the publisher's office. We're waiting for our first delivery. I've been here since 2004 in the United Arab Emirates. I have 2 National Research Foundation grants, and I like to work sort of in the cusp of public policy and with government and with industry. So sort of like trying to understand the whole ecosystem. We have done I also had the Masters of Innovation Management program, like I mentioned. So one of the things we try and do is prepare our students to have this mindset change. Innovation is not just new products. It's about a new way of thinking. And I'm very proud of our students. They have done some amazing things and got several awards. So we try in the school to give them a safe space to sit and think of new ideas, sort of almost embrace failure and come out with new perspectives of how they can solve challenges. So this is something we are very proud of, the way we teach in the Mohammed bin Rashid School of Government and how we help our students achieve their own personal goals. We've also done quite a lot of work in Agile Government. So we began with the policy paper in 2019. We also held a conference on Agile Government in 2019 in February, just before the pandemic hit. So it was very interesting seeing how things were coming out of China, seeing borders closed, and having this conference on Agile Government. During the pandemic, my colleagues and we did a program called Reimagining the Roles of in Times of Crisis. And this was also something we put together because we realized governments don't have a playbook on how to react for something like a pandemic. We had a lot of, systems set up, but people had to reinvent. And we're very proud of the way UAE handled it. We've obviously come through the pandemic really well. But it's still not over if we look around the world and we see, for example, China and Shanghai. So it's really important we all do our part and continue to wear masks and follow the government directions. So, like I said, we have this new book coming in. During this talk, I'll be perhaps referring to some of the chapters from this book. It's an edited book and a lot of our colleagues have contributed to it. So I guess let's start with the word agile. Agile very often is flexibility, the ability to adapt to changes externally, but it's also about adapting to changes internally. And the first thing is, I like this. BCG was one of the first consulting firms to start writing about agile government. They said, agile is not a silver bullet. No one should underestimate the challenges government will face in adopting agile ways of working. So it was clear, even though it's something we want to do, it is not easy to do. And we'll probably unpick that as we keep talking during this short, brief interaction. I'm going to give you a little bit of background. I'm going to define agile governance and agile government. I'm going to mention the differences, some challenges, and some opportunities. There's a lot on history I have, but I've pulled out all of those slides, so I'll just refer to them very shortly. And maybe later, if required, another day, we could talk about the history of agile governance and government. So let's start with a little bit of a background. Why are these topics important? And I think some of you already highlighted, but I'd like to reinforce the importance. So the first important thing is this point in the world, we are increasingly connected. That means a crisis that pops up in one part of the world, somehow or the other cannot be contained. It has its impact in other sides of the world. So government doesn't live in isolation. We're sort of embedded into the global ecosystem, and we've got to understand. So policymakers or anyone working in the government to deliver public value needs to be aware of what's happening around the world. So for example, if you're responsible for food, then you're kind of looking at the Ukraine crisis and saying, okay, here, fertilizer prices have gone up, cost of petrol has gone up. This is going to affect, food delivery systems. What will it do for prices? So you're always trying to connect these dots. You have to. We don't live in isolation. So that's the first most important thing. So if I just look at the government, whose job is to shield, its people from all these horrible things that's happening in the world. So that's our mandate. That's the public value we give, is we protect our people and we make sure that we continue to deliver the public value and the services required. We need to fight against crises, and we've had quite a lot. So the pandemic, 2 years, I think it totally disrupted the way we looked at the world. But there was a forerunner. It was localized. It was Ebola, went across entire West Africa. We're looking at environmental crisis. We've had so many. We've had tsunamis. We've had things like volcano explosions. We've had oil spills. And of course, India faced a big industrial one, Bhopal with the Union Carbide gas leak. We've got financial crises. And of course, the question is, are we heading into a recession, right? So we've seen this over the past. They seem to be cyclical. They come and they go, but they do affect economies. We know supply chain disruptions. We're facing it right now. It's interesting for example, in US, the delivery of new cars has been delayed because of supply chain issues that are coming all the way from China, right? We are looking at technological crises, and there've been a couple of these big ones that have impacted governments. We're looking at, of course, conflict. public sentiments. We're seeing the swing. Brexit was surprising, and it was a vote. We see a lot of governments changing currently right now. I just read Finland and Sweden might join NATO, so we're also seeing realignments happening. And of course, refugees. Ukraine itself has produced tremendous number of refugees. We've not solved the problem of Syria. We've not solved the problem of the previous refugees, and climate change is going to make it worse. So it doesn't look like us in the government are getting a break. We seem to just have to get stronger and stronger. And this is even more challenging because governments don't make money, so they have to manage their budgets very carefully, and often they are resource constrained, right? So it's not that we have 24 hours supply of talent or technology or money. So this makes it really, really hard for us to work. I wanted to show this. In 2017, there was a research conducted, and the question they asked is, do you trust your government a lot to do what is right in your community, in your country? And this was run across some of the countries of the world, and only 15% of the people said yes. So it raises that question where we see worldwide this concept of social contract is changing. So governments around the world now have to actually roll up their sleeves and deliver more. But more importantly, they have to understand why the social contract is changing. We'll touch on these issues as I keep going on. The good news is UAE has done a tremendous job. So in the recent Edelman Middle East Trust Barometer, UAE is one of the most trusted governments in the world. And I think this is largely because of the way we handled the COVID pandemic. It showed how much we were able to adapt to the situation and ensure the best practices for the people. So we realize, if we take this as an example, that governments have no choice except to become agile. That seems to be the only way forward. So if I look at it again, I guess maybe the starting point is, let's see where this term agile governance came in. So if we understand agile means, the ability to quickly adapt or align both internally and externally. Where did these two terms come out? Agile governance and agile government. So we'll start with agile governance. Now, there are two interpretations if I actually look at this. The first one began a lot with intergovernmental organizations and nonprofit organizations. So as IMF, World Bank, and these organizations work across the world, and they were responsible for financial, good practices, there was this increasing need for transparency and accountability. And then with the 4IR, which the WEF sort of highlighted in 2018, we also see technology and ethics. So there was this one hand, all of these questions coming up from agile governance, where we were looking at transparency and accountability and ethics. But there was another interpretation, which I think is far more fascinating, which is the interpretation that it's about governance as in to steer. And the business of governments is to govern. So we've got institutional perspective and we've got the government perspective. Now, as I said, it came across in the government. When you look at it and you trace agile governance, very often the perspective came from digitalization. So as governments started going online with technology, they realized there were some challenges. It was, the people, the technology, not being able to deliver the projects, what they expected, the output. So we noticed in government, a lot of digital projects failed. So again, you're using public money, or in this case, you're accountable to the people for how you use the resources. If we have to define agile governance, I'm going to take the definition from our book. So we're going to refer to it as the overall principles and processes that the country is built on, taking into consideration its political, historical, and social aspects to deliver public good. It can be voluntarily or legal. Now, this is important. If it's the principles and processes, a lot of agile governance is built on values. So what are the values the country has? The government's values need to be translated into every institution that represents government and to all the people that represent government. So this is one of the challenges which we have with agile governance, is getting everyone's values on the same page. So if I look at governance, and I'm going to use a theoretical model, this is the means end model. If the starting point is obviously ethos, which is about, this is a Greek word, and it means credibility and ethics. So what is our credibility and ethics that with which we run the government? And then we're looking at delivery of public value. So it's about having a human-centric impact. So governments, even though a lot of governments in the West are voted on majority, the rule of the government and public value is ideally no one should be left behind. That means governments are inclusive. So it's about each human being. It's not necessarily about the collective. And this requires us, the means process is the optimal management of public resources. So this is the manpower, the technology, the finance, and of course, the natural resources. So when I look at governance, it's the process. So this is the first most important thing. And it starts with the values we have, right? So if the value is, capitalism, or if the value is welfare, so you can see how this changes the way different governments are organized and different governments are run. So now we come to agile government as a term. And historically, when we look at it, it is actually a result of what we call as a cultural turn. So cultural turn is a moment in time where, things pivot or there's a change because of the cultural changes. And if I look back on history, I can actually see 6 periods. So in the late 18th century, because of industrialization and also keeping in mind the communist movement, Weber came up with bureaucracy, and this was to identify how can we specialize in jobs. This is something which the government has actually used, and very often we associate bureaucracy with red tapeism or inefficiency. At the same time, they started looking at stewardship during this period, right? So during this particular phase, it was about, can we get the right people for specialized roles? And again, about stewardship, what was the overall way that we wanted to go and govern? In the 1900s, the second period, now many of these periods overlap, but I'm just going to explain it from history very briefly. In the second period, in the 1900s, we saw a lot of these large colonies break up. So at that particular time, you had colonies where UK dominated, you had the French colonies, the German colonies, and we see a little bit of change coming in over there. And this is the backdrop of democracy movement. It went on into World War I, obviously. So, and with the fall of USSR and, things like that. In the 1930s, we saw a developmental agenda come in. So this was the rise of the intergovernmental organizations that came in. And we started seeing proxies of, because the colonies were breaking up, we saw aid coming in. And this was the way you were exerting power across the world, right? So again, it was requiring a lot of agileness in how governments looked at international affairs. In the 1945s, on the backdrop of World War I and the huge number of refugees created during then, we started seeing this change happening in governments where they started focusing on welfare. It began with the United Kingdom and quickly spread to Scandinavia. These were governments that then started putting people and putting large amounts of their budget for the welfare of their people. The reinvention of governments, the period I've mentioned is 1990s because a book came out on the same topic. But in 1971, the President Carter actually talked about how government was becoming too fragmented and how it was like they weren't talking to each other. And I think the reinvention of government movement actually was a reflection of this. It was talking about how government needed to start acting as a whole. And even if you had 100 different institutions, or if you were federal government and you were local government and municipal government, you still had the same values and you still had the same purposes, and you needed to align together, right? So this was again another big movement or conversation. Of course, in 2010s, we started talking about the fourth industrial revolution. So a lot of it became about technology and of course, artificial intelligence, the big data, social media, these became the trends. We've also seen the big crisis happening here. So the agile governance became as a topic more important than. So we see that agile government is not something brand new. It has existed before, but traditionally it's existed as very, very small entities or small departments, right? Small city-state countries like Singapore have used agile government, of course, the United Arab Emirates and places like Estonia. But in large countries, you don't see it that much. You see them in small projects. So Denmark, for example, created, I think, sort of a design thinking mind lab. UK had the behavioral insights team. So you see these small, interesting projects coming up, very agile. Finland actually had a sort of department which was doing this, crowdsourcing ideas and putting things together, but they never survived for very long. If you look at the history of them, within a short time, they're marginalized, they're closed. So the question is, if people have tried agile government and it's been successful in small departments, then why did they fail? And I think it's simply because, I'm going to come back to that answer actually, because it's in the next slide. So hold that thought on why agile government failed. But let me start with the definition. So I'm going to again quote our book, but I'm also going to quote Edward de Sever, who talks about agile government as mission-centric. So again, we see that thing about the governance angle coming in about values, customer-focused. It's about communication and collaboration, and it continually demonstrates success to customers and public. Now, this is interesting because public value is a perception. It never remains constant. So even today, if you've done a fantastic job, 30 days from now, if something happens, the perception may change. So governments need to always have their ear on the ground and understand how this process is changing. I mean, this is why we have the majlises, right? And historically in UAE, even, the founders of the country have always had the majlis to sit and to listen to the people, to understand what's happening grounds up. We also define agile government as a way of mobilizing public resources. So because we said at the beginning, it's about finance, people, technology. If you're agile, you should be able to combine this in such a way that it optimizes public value, right? And it needs also to create fit for purpose policies and procedures. One of the challenges we have is the pace at which the world is moving is so rapid and so quick that the policies we created long back ago are no longer valid or need to be adapted, but quickly. But we know if we work in the government, this takes time. So how do we do this in a fluid manner? Or how do we create policies that have some flexibility built into them? And again, we talk about agile government as synergy building. So we're looking at multi-level governance, putting it together across different organizations, across federal and across emirate and across municipal. So every organization that represents the government. This has become a lot more challenging right now because governments outsource a lot of their services to the private sector. And the private sector, historically, their mandate is profits not necessarily public value. So we see a little bit of a conflict of interest over here, where on one hand, you've got profits, and on the other hand, we have public value. So really, governance is about getting everybody on the same page and ensuring it works. And that's our responsibility if we outsource. So let's look at the difference between the two. We had a big debate internally when this article was there, and we agree that Agile Governance is bigger than Agile Government. So in the Agile Government, we have not yet got to a whole of a government approach. And this is because we do not have Agile Governance embedded across all government entities, institutions, and the public to deliver public value. So there's this interesting part that the government alone cannot deliver public value. It requires the institutions that represent it, so including the private sector or nonprofit sector, and the people. So we saw that exactly with COVID, right? If I didn't wear a mask and I came and stood in front of you, then we can't stop the pandemic. So we need even the public to get involved to deliver public value. And I think this becomes a hard thing because there's this whole education element about becoming an agile government. So what are some of the challenges? And I can see some questions. Okay, great. So what are some of the challenges that we are facing currently right now? So the first most important thing at the World Government Summit, it was very clear that when they were talking about government skills, the first important challenge is how do I build a heart for service? And this needs to be across every public servant, every contractor, every citizen and resident. And this needs to be amplified. So I think this is a big piece. Are we all on the same page? And in the United Arab Emirates, it's not about just UAE. UAE has committed to global governance. So we have a mandate that's much larger than our country. We can see this in everything that the country does, whether it was the expo or it's the 1 billion meals that we're doing or the aid we're sending around the world. So how can we go and contribute to this heart for service? This was an interesting study. This was done in Italy, and they looked at private sector firms, and they wanted to see if they raised public sector efficiency. So every public servant worked well and increased efficiency. The output for the average firm increased by 9%. So every employee in the public sector actually impacts the economy. And I thought this was so fantastic for me to see, is your role is so important, right? What you do. Also, we know worldwide, the public sector is one of the largest employers. And in terms of government spending, 17% of the GDP goes into salaries. So this is really, really important for us to realize how you and I, if we work for the government, what is the impact that we have? The other important thing about public sector, public value, is the culture that we create. And this is important because we have only one planet. I know we're doing, mission to Mars and mission to outer space, but currently, at least our generation, we're going to live on the Earth. I think our children are going to live on the Earth, and so are their grandchildren. Now, the reason why I have this picture, does anyone know what this bird is called? Does anybody know what this bird is called? A toucan. Yeah, Amir. Nice to see you again, Amir. So yes, the toucan is very indigenous in South America. And it was interesting when I had visited South America, these beautiful birds, the way that they get the Amazon is across most of the South America, and I was in Brazil. And you would find out, the river cuts across multiple times across the land. The bird flies across the river. It actually doesn't fly, it hops. It goes to the tallest tree, it jumps and it glides. Its beak is so heavy, that's the only way it can get across the river. Now, imagine if you cut down a tree. And this is very important for me because we talk a lot about carbon offsetting. We say, I plant a tree to offset carbon, and therefore my company is green. if I cut down a tree, how long do you think it needs to grow for the toucan to be able to climb, to jump off and glide and get safely to the other side? Because if the tree is planted and it's this big and the toucan jumps off of it, it will drown in the river. If you cut down a 150-year-old tree, by planting another tree, we don't offset carbon. So I think I wanted to raise this point because a lot of the things that we do produces carbon, either directly or indirectly. But you and I, we're custodians of this planet. So we need to take care of the least of these creatures or animals or plants, because that's why we were put here. So the public value for customers, that's one important thing we need to go and look at. The other thing is public value for people, right? So how do we take care of them? And this was from one of my trips that I did in Kenya. This is an orphanage where all the children were abandoned because they were people of determination. So the parents didn't want to keep the children and they were abandoned. But this particular gentleman had created an orphanage and he looked after them. One of the ways they funded themselves, because they weren't able to get money, is he created, farms, and he created these fisheries where they would grow fish and sell them. And he would train the children to have a profession. So when they grew up, they would go and they would leave. But this little boy, unfortunately, he has a situation where his brain was not fully developed. So he would never be able to manage on his own. And surprisingly, another boy had adopted him and looked after him. So they had so little, these children, it broke my heart. But the fact that they took care of themselves, I think this is what we have to do. So we need a public value culture where we take care of each other as people. And I think in the United Arab Emirates, with 200 nationalities, and especially with the pandemic and everything that's been going around, there's so many opportunities for us to help. We need a mindset change. Part of having a mindset change, and this is about agile government again, is seeing possibilities rather than probabilities. So I want to explain this. And what do I mean by this? So when you have a probability, it's a number. It can either be high or low, but a possibility is only yes or no. So we need to always look at, yes, there's a possibility, and find a way to make it done. And this is what I love, is we plan 50 years ahead, right? So we're already thinking, what will the world be 50 years ahead? So this is required for an agile government. It doesn't mean that you may not change, because we know that circumstances change, but because governance is about steering, knowing where we want to go, this is critical. Another important fact for agile government is data literacy. We live in a world where either we have too little data or too much, and this is very hard for us to take decisions. So I think it's important for us to realize, what is the limitations of data? How can we convert it into information? Is this information knowledge, and when is it wisdom? Okay, so wisdom comes with experience. And I think this is why we also need to go back and look at the past, or even talk to people who've experienced things from different places. So this is really, really critical if we want an agile government. It's so important that OECD talks about data literacy as one of the most important skills for public servants. And I want to give you an example. So this is an example of how many of us are on social media. By the way, it says here, a typical social media user uses 6 to 6.7 social platforms every month. Can you just put in the chat how many social media platforms you are all in? I mean, do you have like Instagram, Facebook, WhatsApp? Just an idea of how many you have? 4. Okay, so we seem to be below the average of what they've got here. 5 to 6. Okay, so this is great. Now I want to just explain, using this example, how data literacy, actually what I meant. Can you see my chat when I have this open? Okay, so if you see this graph, you can see the 18 to 24-year-olds, 18% of them so this is a map of how old people are, yeah? We see 17% of the world's population is 65 plus, 18% is youth, 18 to 24, below 44 and to 25 years is the bulk of the population, 48, and the 55 to 54, 14%. Now, if I'm assuming it's the 18 to 20, let's say the 18 to 25-year-old who has social media, most of them, and then as the older you get, the less you have, this raises this interesting question: is the big data that we collect is representative of which group? So if you can again put in the chat, which group do you think is the big data capturing? The 18 to 24 years old. Keep in mind it's multiplied by 6.7 or multiplied by 4 or multiplied by 5, depending on how many social media chats you have. So which group do you think is the one that's most represented in big data? The 18 to 24-year-old? Okay, Salma says 25 to 44 based on quantity. The youngest lot. Okay, so most of us are tending to the mid-age group, right? Not the elderly. But remember, again, governments are about being inclusive. So if the 54-year-old to 65 plus year old is not being represented in this big data, we have a problem when we're taking decisions. So the next question is, we have too little data on them, and how do we collect that? So this is why data literacy is so critical, right? When we make decisions, we have to make sure, because governments are inclusive, that it actually represents everyone who we want to go and benefit. You could base it on majority, but again, that's not inclusive, and that's our mandate, right? So these are questions. I mean, this would be a whole other talk, which we don't have time for, and I'm very much aware of the time. But this is, again, the example of utilizing, this is another example, utilizing human capital, right? So if we assume that we do go and replace a lot of capital with machines, then the retirement age will go down. And if the retirement age goes down, there'll be a lot more people who aren't working. And if a lot more people aren't working, then what do they do, and how do we fund looking after them? So then it becomes the responsibility of maybe the 20 to 40-year-olds to go and take care of the 40 to 59-year-olds. Or we put the burden on the people who are 20 years old and less to take care of all the people before. So this again raises a lot of questions for governments, and they're struggling with this. In those countries that have elderly populations, you're talking Germany, Japan, USA, a lot of Europe, these are the countries actually that also have been encouraging 4IR, because for them, robotics and AI is very critical because they don't have young workforce. This includes China, by the way. But in those countries that have welfare programs, for example, like Germany, the burden of managing this and the welfare of the elderly falls on the younger people who pay taxes. So the social contract becomes very much more, I mean, for them, it's a different social contract, but much more challenging. So it raises all of these questions, and we need to always keep and understand why these things are happening. You know, what's happening in the French election, what will happen in the German elections. So this gives us some idea, because the burden increases and the social contract changes. Another thing that agile governments need to go, and the challenges that we have, is how we look at foresight. How do we predict the future? So normally we're predicting and we're looking at scenarios, right? But I like this perspective that scenarios alone are not enough. We have to understand the past is a history, and there's always multiple perspectives of the past. And therefore, we will have multiple scenarios and this is really, really critical. It depends on how we look at the past. And if we look at a future point of where we want to go, it's important to identify multiple pathways to get there. So let's say in 10 years, I want to be the most innovative country. It is not just one path to get there, but it's at least 4 or 5 paths. That will make me truly agile, because if one path doesn't work, I can go to backup plan 2, backup plan 3, backup plan 4. So this way of thinking needs to change. Maybe it's also linked in some ways to a mindset change. And this was a great example. Any of you familiar with this? This is the so-called metaverse. So this is Facebook's interpretation, and they had unintended consequences. Luckily, it was a testing period. It's great. But one of the challenges we have with new technology always is that it's being deployed and adopted at scale. So I've always used this example. If the airplane took 68 years to reach 50 million people, Pokemon Go as a game took 19 days. So governments don't have much time in terms of how to respond, especially since we're looking at governance. So it becomes really challenging that we think about unintended consequences, both indirect and direct, both positive and negative. We have to be thinking always like that. The other thing agile governments need to manage is how do we go and look at impact near or far. So here's an example: the electric car versus the petrol car, or email versus courier. Which one should we choose? And here is some work my students did in class, which was about recycling. So I think this came from Indra when she went and looked at it. This is about how much of electronic waste we produce. And you can also see that a lot of the electronic waste is not properly recycled. It's distributed across the world. So 10 to 20% is illegally exported to non-OECD countries, and only 78 countries covered by legislation. Electronic waste is toxic for water, so it's as bad as maybe carbon in some way. So one is polluting the sky, the other one is polluting land and water. Okay, so governments always are working on trade-offs. If you work in the government sector, that ability to think near and far are critical for you in decision-making processes. Of course, we look at public sector skills, and this is important. This was a study by McKinsey, and they talked about a shortage of people with skills. And they're talking about digital citizenship skills, for example. Considering that the public sector is 17% of all employees, this is really important, because what we're hearing right now is 30% of the public sector does not have the required skills. That's for the future. So this was a paper that's on our website, so you could pick it up and just read it, but it gives you an idea of what are the agile skills that we require. We identified in a design thinking workshop 3 types of skills: policy entrepreneurship skills. This is the ability, and this was actually something we said lower management should have, the ability to think out of the box at innovative solutions, risk-taking. Middle management has more boundary spanning skills, the ability to connect different people together, to go out of their comfort zone, meet people, look at different ideas. And senior management is about transformational skills, the ability to empower teams and steer them in the direction in which we want to go in terms of public value. Now that we understand some of the challenges, let's look at some of the opportunities that can be there, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So the first one is we need to embrace the purpose. And I think this comes from the vision of the leaders. We know the world is shifting eastward, so this is an opportunity we don't want to miss. More and more, we're seeing the economic center of the world moving towards the east. We see this strongly also in terms of how the East is gearing up in responses in terms of industry, in terms of supply chain. I think this is important for us to realize it's an opportunity for us. After all, everything started in the East, went to the West, and coming back to the East. We need to realize the opportunity that we have here in the UAE is the diversity of thought. There is no other country with 200 nationalities, 300 languages, all in a small vicinity. So the first thing you should be doing is trying to reach out to as many people from different nationalities, because that's where you get information. You are in that unique opportunity to get live information straight from people who are connected to their home country. We also see the UAE has done some tremendous amount of work. Of course, recently we are looking at the Agile Nations Charter, and this was something that's very important and close to us. This was endorsed. We talk about Agile Government quite regularly. As you can see, this is something the Prime Minister's office also talks about very often. You need to ask yourself, in the midst of all of this, if you need to help the government become agile, then how are you managing knowledge? And are you a broker, and can you connect different people together? So this chart is an interesting one. It's about artificial intelligence. It's about patents. But you'll see, for example, here is a gentleman, and you can see how many patents he has, and you can see how many lines radiate from him. So he's a connector. And when I looked at the study, what I found was interesting is the people who are boundary spanners are collaborators. They don't work by themselves. They work with different groups of people. So if you cannot get outside your department, if you cannot connect with different people, then we will have a problem in Agile Government, because Agile Government is really working with people from different backgrounds and trying to get different perspectives, because the better you define a problem, the stronger is the solution. An important part and an opportunity is, of course, knowledge sharing. So we have a lot of knowledge in the UAE. This is both from experience, but also from different countries. So I think it's about how can we build this knowledge sharing. And research actually shows this only happens if we have a forum of psychological safety. If I don't have the feeling of safety, I won't trust you. And if I don't trust you, I wouldn't share the knowledge. So you need to create that. So in your own organization, the question you should be asking is, have we created an environment of psychological safety that builds trust and allows knowledge sharing? And if you look at the UAE and our ranking in the Global Innovation Index, we are ranked number 33 overall, but there's some areas that we obviously need to do better, and that's creative outputs and the knowledge and technology outputs. So I think this is important when we think of knowledge outputs. It starts with the culture of socialization, right? And this is where you take knowledge that's in people's head, or what you call as tacit knowledge, and through interaction, they share it. So how do we create that culture of socialization? And that's another good point. Do you always have, tea, coffee, even your breaks in your work with the same people, or are you reaching out and meeting new people to socialize? The other thing that you can do as an opportunity is about asking questions. So this is about the systems thinking. It's about ask, seek, read, cross-verify, and challenge. This is curiosity driven, right? So I'm going to give you this example of semiconductors industry. And I think this is fascinating, because when you think of semiconductors, which is the bedrock of the AI industry, it is the fourth most traded industry in the world, right? And I was reading a report that says, the semiconductor travels so many times across the world. So just look at this. The process requires it to go up and down across the world at least 2 or 3 times. So if you look at this, then the first question in systems thinking is maybe from a supply chain. Where's my vulnerabilities? Could it affect any of the things that I'm depending on? And surprisingly, when you look at Ukraine, they produce a gas that's required for etching of silicon chips. So I'm really curious to know whether this will impact delivery of silicon chips, because they're one of the major suppliers. The other supplier is in Brazil. The other thing that you need to learn how to do is reframe, which is start looking at problems in multiple different ways. There is another training program coming up very shortly, so watch this space, that will actually go into how do we do reframing. And I think this is something I love to highlight. Innovation does not need to be expensive or cool. So with studies on innovation, and the first one was the HBR study. It talked about how there were 3 ways to make profits. And governments, remember, some governments do find revenue-making mechanisms. And we find out that these are three areas that governments also need to excel, right? We find out that inorganic growth is very often risky. So growth outside the organization is risky, more risky than organic growth. And also we find out that the big disruptive innovations come only when you can combine old knowledge in new ways from teams, right? So we come back to that very interesting thing of, are you a boundary spanner? Are you a connector? Because that's what we need for agile governments to succeed. Last but not least, I think it's about mindfulness for us. Our role, and what I mean by mindfulness, it's about here and now. Our role is to deliver public value today and tomorrow. And an agile government has to, on one hand, balance mission, operations and processes, and then legitimacy and authority. If by any chance one of them has more emphasis, if you overemphasize mission or operations or legitimacy, we kind of lose focus on human centrist, being human centered. And this is what we require when we're being an agile government that delivers public value. So last, an agile government is about shaping the future, embracing the present, and leveraging the past. And if you feel this is an interesting topic and you want to know more, we can help. Please, or if you want to join our Masters of Innovation program where we do a lot of this, you can send us an email at admissions@mbrsg.ac.ae. I think my colleague, Ms. Yusra, is also over here and she can answer questions if you want. But also contact me. I mean, my email is also up over there in the beginning. I'm happy to take questions right now, and hopefully this has given you a small glimpse into what agile government is and what it isn't, and you've got some idea of the opportunities and challenges. So please feel free to put on your mic. How can a government be agile if the public do not trust it? Oh, I think you can still be agile if the public does. Well, that's a difficult one, Amir. We see a lot of governments working. In our definition of agile government, you need to deliver public value. So if the public doesn't trust it, then you've already lost that question of public value, right? So if I take the definition which we've put, where we're looking at the delivery of public goods and public value, then that I would not call that an agile government. Osama, I'm sorry you sent a question. I didn't quite get it. What is that question? Amir, I hope that answers your question. Thank you, Moza. Yusra asked if agile mean exactly flexible or resilient. Agile has two concepts. One is agile to external changes, and one is the ability to align what you adapt to externally, internally. So when there is an external stimulus like a crisis, you have to adapt, but you will not succeed unless you align internally your organizational structure, your culture, your people. So it requires both. When we look at agile, we're looking at alignment and adaptation. If you have any questions on any of the master's programs, feel free to ask. My colleagues are here and they'll be happy to answer questions. Yep, Ayman, that's a good. Noura, so the new book is coming up, the book that I mentioned. You could go and look at that if you could, Mohammed, sure. So the book is called Agile Government. If you put the book and my name, it will pop up, but that will have a lot on Agile Government itself. You'll find some material, and I think that's interesting. We had 24 chapters, and they're written from authors all around the world in different perspectives. How do we motivate public servants? That's an interesting thing. So this was also brought up at the World Government Summit. The first one was how are we recruiting people? So we need to recruit for values and for a heart for service. Second thing, I think, is human resources has a tremendous job to do. So I think they set the standards, right? So if you look at your human resources team and say, are they walking the talk? If they are not walking the talk, it's very difficult if your senior management is not walking the talk to set the standards. So I think it's about creating that culture change internally first, and that's how we can change employees. My experience working in multiple organizations is actually senior management has a strong role on the culture of the organization, so employees will tend to reflect what your senior management holds dear. I hope that answers your question. You're most welcome. If there's anything else, you can drop me an email. Yes, happy employees equal productivity. I agree. I'm here. Nice seeing you, Dinua. The class is commencing. We're already taking in applications currently right now, Sony. So if you will, Yusra, would you like to answer that question?
Yes, we are accepting applications now, and the study starts, or the orientation day for new students starts on the 20th of August, but we urge students to complete their application before the state and submit their documents. So I'll reshare the links here in the chat for all of you.
You can also see the email that's down, admissions@mbrsg.ac.ae, and we have a WhatsApp number, +971 55 899 5114. So nice seeing you, Hima. Thanks, Hind.
Good evening, Professor. How are you?
Good evening. I am very fine. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was very informative. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome.
All right.
Thank you for coming. I know it's late.
Yeah, but it's of course, no, but this time is fine for me. It's fine because it's not at work, no? So I can concentrate more in this time. All right, no problem.
Does there exist a recommended framework to evaluate agility adoption in organizations? There are kind of lots of frameworks for agility. I think Agile Government, we're still putting them together right now. But agility, there are lots. In fact, OECD looks at strategic agility as an example. But like I said, I think Agile Government is slightly different than that. But there is some work our school is doing in the executive management course on strategic agility. If you want to contact me, I can put you in touch with people. Thanks, Stephanie. Hi, Salma. Okay, I think if there's no more questions, we can close too. I wish you all a very good night and have a great day working tomorrow.